Celestine Broward was 37 years old, 14 months divorced, and standing in the parking lot of a gas station on the outskirts of Memphis when she scratched a number off a lottery ticket that she had bought on a Tuesday afternoon on impulse. A thing she did perhaps twice a year, always on the way home from somewhere that had required more of her than she had planned to give, and realized, standing in the October wind in a coat she had owned for 6 years, that she had just won $300 million. She stood very still. She had been a logistics coordinator for 11 years at a regional freight company, a woman who spent her professional life ensuring that the right things arrived in the right places at the right times, and her first thought was not about the money. Her first thought was procedural. She thought, there is a process for this, and I need to know what it is before I do anything else. Her second thought was about her ex-husband. Because she knew, with the specific certainty of a woman who had been married to a man for 9 years and had spent 14 months afterward learning the shape of who he actually was, that when Terrence Broward found out about this money, and he would find out, he would believe he was entitled to it. He would have a rationale. He would have an argument. He would have a version of history in which this ticket connected back to something he had contributed, some sacrifice he had made, some period of the marriage during which his presence in her life had planted the seed that the ticket had now yielded, and he would deliver this argument with the confidence of a man who had spent 41 years being told that his confidence was the same as being right. He had already tried to take things that weren't his. The divorce had confirmed that. He had claimed the house she had maintained, the account she had built, the 9 years she had given and he had spent. He had gotten considerably less than he asked for, and considerably more than he deserved. And that settlement was done, and final, and documented. But $300 million was not a thing that stayed quiet. And Terrence Broward was not a man who stayed quiet when he thought there was something in the room that should belong to him. She put the ticket in the interior pocket of the 6-year-old coat, against her chest. She drove home. She called her attorney before she called anyone else. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The apartment on Lamar Avenue was the first place Celestine had lived alone in her adult life. She had moved from her mother's house to a shared apartment in her mid-20s, from there to the house she had shared with Terrence, and from the house to this apartment in the month the divorce was finalized. And she had spent the first 2 weeks in it, adjusting to the specific quality of silence that came from a space that belonged entirely to her. The silence had felt strange, and then it had felt like something she had earned, and by the time 3 months had passed, it felt like the right size for her life. She had made the apartment hers in the ways she could manage on a logistics coordinator's salary. A bookshelf she had assembled herself along the main wall. Plants on every windowsill, because she had always kept plants, and Terrence had always said there were too many. A small garden on the balcony that she had planted in her first spring, there in the planters she had bought at a hardware store, and filled herself on a Saturday morning while listening to the gospel station her grandmother had listened to every Sunday of her adult life. The garden was not large. It had tomatoes and basil and 1 dahlia she had planted from a bulb her mother had given her, and it was hers in the way that only things you have tended from the beginning are yours. Her grandmother, a woman named Viola, who had run a catering business in Memphis for 40 years out of her home kitchen, and who had died when Celestine was 29, had told her more than once that money was only power if you knew what it was for. She had meant it as a caution against waste, but Celestine had always understood it as something larger, as a reminder that resources without purpose were just numbers, and that purpose was what made any of it matter, and that the work of knowing the purpose was the most important work a person could do before the resources arrived. Celestine had grown up watching her grandmother work. She had watched her take an order for a church supper. Price it correctly without apology or negotiation. Purchase exactly what was needed without waste. Prepare it to the standard that brought the same clients back year after year, and deposit the proceeds in a savings account she had opened in 1971, and that was still open when she died. Viola had not been wealthy. She had been precise and disciplined and absolutely clear about what the work was for, and she had never once in 40 years priced her work below what it was worth, because she had understood, before the word existed in the vocabulary Celestine would later learn, that underpricing was a form of self-erasure, and that self-erasure was the one thing she was not willing to practice. Celestine had tried to learn those things. She had not always succeeded. She had, for 9 years, priced herself below what she was worth in a marriage that had taken more than it returned, and she was done with that accounting. She had started the new one. She had met Terence at a work function when she was 26, a cheerful and energetic man who was good at parties and good at first impressions, and who had a quality of forward motion that she had found, at 26, both attractive and reassuring. He was going places, in the way that some people were going places before it became clear that the places they were going were not the ones they had described. They had married at 28. For the first 4 years, the marriage had functioned in the way of a well-maintained machine, not passionate, but reliable, and reliability had seemed like enough. In the 5th year, things began to loosen at the joints in ways she could feel before she could name them, and by the 7th year she understood what she was living in, and by the 9th year she had done what needed to be done. The divorce had been difficult in the precise and documented way that divorces were difficult when one party believed the accounting favored him, and the other party had retained competent counsel. Terence had wanted the house she had helped maintain, the joint accounts she had consistently contributed more to, and a portion of her retirement contributions on the grounds that his presence in the marriage had enabled her professional stability, which had enabled the retirement contributions, which therefore contained an element of his contribution. A theory of financial causation so elastic it could have covered almost anything, which was the point of it. Her attorney had addressed this argument methodically and in writing, document by document, and the final settlement had given Terence a sum that her attorney described as the floor of reasonableness, and that Celestine understood as more than she would have preferred, and less than he had believed he was entitled to, which was the nature of settlements, and the reason people had attorneys. The settlement was signed. The divorce was finalized. Celestine moved to the apartment on Lamar Avenue, assembled the bookshelf, planted the balcony garden, and began the careful, unglamorous, necessary work of making a life that fit her correctly. 14 months later, on a Tuesday afternoon in October, she had stopped at a gas station on the outskirts of Memphis on the way home from a site visit that had run 3 hours long, and bought a lottery ticket and a bottle of water, with the specific mindlessness of a person who needed something small and uncomplicated after a day that had been. Neither. She had stood in the parking lot in the October wind in the 6-year-old coat because she had never had the patience to wait until she got home to scratch a ticket, and she had scratched the ticket, and the number under the foil was $300 million. She stood very still for longer than she knew. She looked at the number again. She looked at it a third time. She was a logistics coordinator, and she believed in verification, in checking the number against the source, in confirming the data before acting on it. And she checked the number against the ticket 3 times, and then looked up at the gas station canopy above her, and the October sky beyond it, and the ordinary parking lot that was still exactly what it had been 30 seconds ago. And then she looked at the ticket again. $300 million. Her hands did not shake. She was not sure why they didn't. She put the ticket in the interior pocket of the coat, against her sternum, and stood for a moment, with her hand pressed flat over it like something that needed to be kept warm. Her second thought. Her first had been procedural. about the process for claiming, was about Terence. She drove home with her hands steady on the wheel and the ticket against her chest, and the sequence running in her mind with the same organized efficiency that 11 years in logistics had made automatic in her. Identify the steps. Confirm the correct order. Do not skip any of them. And do not let the size of the thing make you move faster than the thing required. Step 1 was the attorney. Step 1 was always the attorney. Her attorney's name was Rosalind Batts, and she had represented Celestine through the divorce with a thoroughness that Celestine had found both reassuring and occasionally frightening, in the way that very competent people were occasionally frightening. She answered her phone at 6:15 in the evening and listened to what Celestine said without interrupting. When Celestine finished, Rosalind was quiet for 4 seconds. Then she said, "Do not tell anyone. Not your mother. Not your sister. Not anyone from work. Not yet. Where is the ticket?" Celestine said, "Against my chest." Rosalind said, "Good. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, my office. Bring the ticket in the same pocket. We are going to go through every step of this together before you sign anything, speak to the Lottery Commission, or allow your name to appear anywhere in connection with this." Celestine said, "Terence." Rosalind said, "I know. We are going to address that before it becomes something he can use. Get some sleep." She did not sleep well, which was honest. She lay in the apartment on Lamar Avenue and looked at the ceiling and thought about her grandmother and thought about what $300 million was for, because Viola had been very clear that money without purpose was just a number, and Celestine intended to know the purpose before anyone else knew the number. She thought about her mother, who still lived in the house in South Memphis where Celestine had grown up, and who had worked as a home health aide for 22 years, and who had never once in those 22 years been paid what the work was worth. She thought about the catering business her grandmother had built, and the church clients who still asked about Viola's recipes at funerals and holiday gatherings. She thought about the neighborhood community center 2 blocks from her mother's house that had been operating on a deficit for 6 years, and that the city had been discussing closing for 3. She thought, "I know what it's for." Rosalind had a financial attorney in the office at 8 the next morning, a man named Douglas who specialized in large asset protection and who had the measured, unhurried quality of someone who had helped people navigate exactly this situation many times, and who understood, from long experience, that speed was the enemy of structure, and that structure was the only thing that would matter later. He wore reading glasses on a chain and had a yellow legal pad, and he made notes in a handwriting so small it looked like coding. Together, the 3 of them mapped the full sequence across the conference table, with Rosalind's coffee getting cold between them and the Memphis morning, light coming through the east window, and Celestine asking questions with the specific precision of someone who needed to understand every step before she would agree to take it. The claim structure, the trust vehicle that would hold the winnings and through which every distribution would flow, creating a documented barrier between the raw winnings and any subsequent claim against them. The anonymity provisions available under Tennessee law, which were not absolute, but which bought time, and time was what they needed. The documentary chain that would establish, in the kind of detail that survived legal challenge, that the ticket had been purchased with post-divorce funds from a post-divorce account on a post-divorce date by a post-divorce person who had no obligation to anyone else in the transaction. Douglas said, "Has anyone else touched the ticket?" Celestine said, "No one." He said, "Was it purchased with any funds that could be characterized as jointly held?" She said, "It was purchased with my personal debit card, on an account opened 6 months after the divorce was finalized, funded entirely by my employment income from that point forward." Rosalind said, "The chain is clean. The settlement agreement is comprehensive and final. There is no legal mechanism by which your former spouse can claim an interest in assets acquired after finalization under these circumstances. Douglas said, "He will try anyway. People in his position always try." Rosalind said, "He will try. We will be ready before he finishes drafting the argument." They spent 4 hours building the structure. Celestine asked 27 questions. She knew because she counted them on the legal pad Douglas had given her when she ran out of room on her own. Every question was answered completely and without condescension, which she registered as its own kind of respect. The trust was established by the end of the week. The lottery claim was filed the following Monday through a process Rosalind and Douglas had choreographed with the Lottery Commission's legal department, using every provision available under Tennessee statute to protect Celestine's identity from public disclosure. The claim was verified. The winnings were confirmed. The wire transfer instructions were delivered to the trust account. $300 million landed in an account with Celestine's name on the trust documents on a Thursday afternoon in November, and Celestine was sitting in Rosalind's conference room when the confirmation came through, and she looked at the number on the screen and thought about her grandmother, and thought about the community center 2 blocks from her mother's house that had been operating on a deficit for 6 years, and she pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed once. The way you breathe when something has arrived and you are deciding what shape you are going to hold while you carry it. Terence called on a Friday. She did not know precisely how he had found out, and she did not need to know. Rosalind had explained months before that anonymity provisions were durable but not permanent, that a motivated party with resources would eventually locate what they were looking for, and that the correct response to that reality was to build every protection before the search concluded, rather than after. They had built every protection. The search had concluded on a Friday, apparently, because the calls started at 9 in the morning and did not stop. He called 4 times on Friday. She sent none of the calls to voicemail and answered none of them directly, because Rosalind had been clear that any statement Celestine made, casual, emotional, or otherwise, could be used in subsequent proceedings. And Celestine had spent 11 years in logistics and understood better than most people that the things you did not put into the system were the things that could not be used against you later. On Saturday, he appeared at the apartment building and buzzed her interphone 3 times in a row, and then once more, slowly, the way a person buzzes when they want you to understand that they are still there. She did not answer. She stood in her kitchen and drank her coffee and let him ring. On Monday, his attorney sent a letter to Rosalind's office asserting that the lottery ticket had been purchased with proceeds traceable to the marital estate and that his client intended to pursue a claim against the winnings on the grounds that the financial foundation enabling the purchase derived from the 9-year marriage partnership. Rosalind called Celestine after reading it. She said, "The argument requires them to establish a traceable connection between marital funds and the specific debit card transaction. That connection does not exist. The account was opened 6 months post-finalization. The funding source is exclusively post-divorce employment income. The chain is documented at every link." She paused. This is a man asking a court to agree that every financial decision a divorced person makes for the rest of their life can be traced back to the marriage. No court in Tennessee will agree to that. Celestine said, "How long before they understand that?" Rosalind said, "Depends on how long his attorney lets him pay for the education." The answer, it turned out, was 11 weeks. The answer, it turned out, was 11 weeks. Terence's counsel filed a motion in January. Rosalind responded with the complete documentation package in February: the divorce settlement, the date of finalization, the account records showing the debit card's post-divorce origin, the trust structure, the purchase timestamp, and a legal brief that Celestine, who had read every word of it, considered the clearest and most efficient demolition of a weak argument she had encountered outside of a graduate seminar. The motion was denied in March. Terrence's counsel filed a notice of intent to appeal in April. The appeal was reviewed and denied in June. Terrence's counsel did not file again. Terrence's mother called Celestine in July. It was the second call from that family she had received, and like the first, a brief and pained apology from his sister the previous autumn, it was an act of honesty offered without expectation of return. His mother said she was sorry for what her son had done and that she hoped Celestine would use the money for good things. Celestine said she intended to. His mother said she believed her. They got off the phone. By the following spring, the Viola Broward Community Center had opened on the block 2 streets from Celestine's mother's house in South Memphis, named for the woman who had fed that neighborhood for 40 years, and who had understood that money was only power if you knew what it was for. The center had a teaching kitchen, a financial literacy program, an after-school tutoring operation that ran 5 days a week, and a catering certificate program that produced its first class of 8 graduates in May, each of whom had been trained in pricing their work correctly. Celestine's mother had stopped working as a home health aide in October of the previous year, when Celestine had sat down with her at the kitchen table of the South Memphis house and described what was possible and asked her what she wanted. Her mother had been quiet for a long time. Then she had said, "I want to sit on the porch in the mornings without going anywhere after." Celestine had said, "Then that's what you'll do." She did. Terrence had taken a position out of state after the appeal was denied, a move that several mutual acquaintances mentioned to Celestine over the following months with a specific neutrality of people who understood they were delivering information but not commentary. She noted it and moved on. He was no longer a factor in any equation she was running. There was a man named Nathaniel, a civil engineer she had met through the community center's construction project in the early planning stages, when she had been in every site meeting and he had been the project lead, and they had spent 16 months solving problems together in the practical, collaborative way of people who both understood that the work was what mattered, and who had found, somewhere in those 16 months, that the collaboration had extended beyond the work. He was steady and plain-spoken, and had never once performed anything for her. Not interest, not capability, not the particular kind of reassurance that men sometimes performed for women they had decided needed it. He simply showed up and did the work, and was honest about the things he didn't know, and curious about the things she did, and she had found that a very long way from nothing. She was not in a hurry. She had spent 11 years in logistics, and she knew better than anyone that the most important variable in any complex process was patience, and that the systems built with patience lasted longer than the ones built quickly, and that what lasted was what mattered. On a Saturday morning in June, she was on the balcony of the apartment on Lamar Avenue. She had not moved, not yet, because the apartment felt like hers in a way she was not ready to trade, and because she had not yet decided what the next version of that should look like, and because she had learned, over 40 years of watching her grandmother and 14 months of building her own life from bare wood, that you did not leave a place before you understood what you were leaving it for. With coffee, the balcony garden coming in for its 3rd summer, the tomatoes fat on the vine and the basil thick, and the one dahlia that had volunteered itself from a seed she had not planted thriving at the edge of the planter in a color so deep and particular it looked like something chosen. Below her the city was doing its ordinary morning work. Her mother was on her porch in South Memphis, drinking her coffee and going nowhere after. The Viola Broward Community Center would open its doors in 3 hours for the Saturday tutoring session. $300 million sat in a trust that was being deployed, carefully and with full documentation, toward purposes her grandmother would have recognized and approved. She pressed the mug between both palms and looked at the dahlia she had not planted. Her grandmother had told her that money was only power if you knew what it was for. She knew what it was for. She had always known, she thought. She had just needed enough of it to make the knowing visible to the people and the places that had been waiting for it, without knowing they were waiting. She was free. She was solvent. She was unbothered. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.